Hope it works. And that's also to mention that the meeting today is going to be recorded just as the previous workshops, just for you to know. So manage your own comfort, your own safety. But obviously, if you can and feel safe enough and are willing to turn on your camera, to be with your face, to be with your name, that's much, I know, just much warmer place to be in, where we see the faces of each other and see the actual human beings on the other side of the screen. Okay, show me by hands how many of you have been to one of or few of the previous workshops of PeaceLab. How many of us are here? Okay. Most of the first page of my screen are with raised hands. Cool, thanks. You can put your hands down. And now, how many of you are new and you are coming here for the first time on any workshop of this project? 1, 2, 3. Oh, also quite a few of you. That's cool. That's nice to see that we keep attracting new people because that's the original intention of the project. Just very briefly, this project, as it's called PeaceLab, and you can find it on the website, that the whole thing is about something we call civic peace building, which we don't have a clear definition, or I'd even say a clue what it actually is. That's the term we came up with, meaning all the peace initiatives and movements and practices which are not so much on the high political diplomatic level, even though that's included as well, but more like, on the ground grassroots initiatives. And we invite experts and like those who are in the field, not just researching or thinking about it, but actually, having done or doing the peace work on the ground. And Neil Jarman is one of them. I guess we'll hand the word in a few minutes. Yeah, and I just want to introduce the team. Actually, I don't know. There is no clear boundary of the team of PeaceLab now because the project has also transformed with time. So, there was the core team which started the whole thing, but then we also have the community now, those people who are in the so-called PeaceLab circle and start their own initiatives, and we have different working groups. So it's kind of an interwoven thing where many people are contributing something from small to big for these workshops and for the whole thing to keep happening. So those of you who are considered to be a part of PeaceLab in whichever way, can you also show yourself just for us to see you, us? Yeah. Thank you. Dimo, would you like to say, or any from the team, would you like to say, some anything about the project in general before I brief us about the structure of today's workshop?
Well, I'd like to say a few words why we wanted to have Neil, I guess. And in part is to do the whole concept, and in part is due to the work that Neil does. So I don't know if that counts, but maybe someone else wants to jump in.
Оля, Лена, Стася. Right. Okay. Then I will just super briefly say a couple of technical things. So we are going to have 2 hours today, and the introduction is almost over. Bear with us for another minute. Then we're going to hand the words to Neil, and Neil is going to speak. So there's going to be more or less, lecture style thing for about half an hour, 40 minutes. And then we're going to have questions and answers. So definitely, if you have questions, do write them in the chat. I know, Neil, you let us know if you are willing to answer them right ahead or maybe after the main part is over. So you manage it whichever way you want. If you don't speak English, you can also write questions in the chat in Russian, and perhaps some of us or some of you might be able to translate them on the fly in the chat. And that that has been happening in the previous workshops as a self-organized thing, so don't hesitate to do that. And then we're going to jump into breakout groups. So we're going to have some discussions and interactive part in the second half of the workshop. So also be prepared for about 20 or 30 minutes. We're going to just be, going deeper into what we've heard and thinking about how it can be applied, what are the controversies, what are the lessons. So not for us just to be passive listeners, but to engage. And then we're going to return for the closing part of the workshop. And that's our plan for 2 hours, basically. Yeah. And yeah, all of you, I guess, at least supposedly, have registered either on the website or in TimePad. And there were options to either, buy the ticket or make the donation or register for free. So the whole project is non-commercial, and there is an option to come and participate for free. If for any reason you haven't made a donation or purchased a ticket, but then you decide to do so after the workshop, we'll write in the chat how you can do that as well, because it lets us sustain the project, like to pay for the translation and the technical costs and all of that stuff. And that's pretty much it from my side. Yeah, and then Dimo, maybe you introduce why Neil is here and smoothly hand it over to him.
Yeah, I'll do. And I'm kind of excited and looking forward to it. And in part, a part of me, right from the start, knew that we would have Neil at some point. Because once we were thinking about the whole concept of the PeaceLab, an idea that we introduce first of all Russian-speaking audience, but not only them, to various contexts of violent conflicts, of wars, of people being not able to even talk to each other, but then at some point through civil society efforts finding a way to do so, finding a way to overcome difficult past, and finding a way to reach out across the barricades, across the front lines, and finding some sort of a peace, even if temporary. And of course, Northern Ireland was a part of that idea also, in part because I read, I heard about some of the work that Neil has done. But first, I met Neil as a human rights expert, as an expert on freedom of assembly issues. And I remember we worked together in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Russia. And I also remember very well that we even brought Neil to Voronezh at some point. And it was very surprising to see how government officials at the local level were explaining to Neil and to us that they are not able to allow peaceful assemblies because they will lead to some riots, to some troubles, that people will start, growing violent. And it's funny to see how, in reaction to this, Neil has just, quietly his kind of partly academic, partly expert demeanor has just said that, well, you just have not known about the Northern Ireland experience. And people were shooting at each other. And a way to overcome that was actually to encourage people to use assemblies as a way to express themselves. So, I mean, that was kind of my impression back then. And then, of course, I learned and read more about the conflict and about how violent it was, and at the same time that it's turned into some sort of a resolution. And of course, Neil will talk about it in a while. But for me, this talk is in part about the experience of Northern Ireland, in part about civil society efforts, in part about the importance of assemblies, people expressing themselves in the street and reaching out across those divides, finding relations to their opponents, establishing relations with the police, and seeing humans in each other. And that work inspired and continues to inspire me. And I hope that after you hear Neil, it will also inspire you. And maybe after that, we can also think together how relevant that is to the difficult context in which we work at this moment. So at this, I'll stop and heartily welcome Neil once more and pass the word to you.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, and glad for the introduction. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And I'm going to talk to you about, as Dimitri said, about the experiences of Northern Ireland in peace building work. I've been just a bit about myself. I've been working on peace and conflict issues in Northern Ireland for just about 30 years now. I'm academically trained, but I haven't, all that work was not working through university. I spent very limited time working in the university. I worked with civil society organizations. I ran an NGO for the best part of 20 years. And I kind of slipped into conflict issues by accident. So just as I slipped into human rights issues somewhat by accident rather than pre-planning. But I want to talk today about the role of civil society in conflict situation in Northern Ireland and the transition in Northern Ireland. I will give you a very, very brief two-sentence context, because as Dimitri said, you should know about it, or you probably will know something. And I could also spend the whole of the time I have talking about the background and the context and understanding of the situation. So basically, the relationship between Ireland and Britain has been one of conflict, colonization, settlement, rebellion, resistance for several hundred years. It led to the creation of a small separate state in Northern Ireland, a division of Ireland between an independent republic and a part of the north of Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. The state was marked by extreme discrimination. It was split, the population was split between those who were pro a united Ireland and those who favoured Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom. And that is basically the root of the problem, is whether Northern Ireland should rejoin a united Ireland or whether it should remain part of the United Kingdom. That remains the fundamental problem. In the 1960s, activists here followed the movement of the civil rights movement in America and started campaigning against discrimination, against the Catholic population, the pro-Irish population. The end of the 60s, that led to an armed conflict. A three-way armed conflict developed. Pro-Irish armed groups led by the Irish Republican Army, who are quite well known, the IRA. The British Army and the British state actors, the police, were on another corner of the triangle. And there are also pro-British state armed groups as well. So it was quite a complex process went on from 1969 onwards. Just jumping ahead briefly, in the 1990s, the conflict effectively ceased. The armed groups, irregular armed groups, called ceasefires in 1994. And this led to a peace agreement, a formal peace agreement being signed in 1998, which was really signaled the end of the formal end of the agreement, of the conflict. The agreement was signed between the British and the Irish governments with the input from local political actors and also with the influence of the American governments as well, with a special envoy from it was Bill Clinton at the time. And just, I'll leave that hanging there, but it was an important thread running through that, the diversity of actors involved in the process. The agreement itself was very much a top-down process, very much in line with what was considered to be good practice around peace agreements, and still is effectively good practice around peace agreements. So it involved constitutional amendments from the Irish Constitution and by the Irish government, and also by changes to the Constitution by the British government, which ultimately meant that if the population in North of Ireland decided to change its constitutional status, that would be permitted by and facilitated by both governments, i.e. Ideally not leading to further armed conflict over the issue. It involved changes to institution, local government reform, devolved government. It involved reform of the security sector, including a major reform of the police, which I'll talk about a bit more. It involved a DDR process for the armed groups, a demobilization, demilitarization, and reintegration process, which included the release of all political prisoners, all prisoners associated with the armed groups. It involved introduction of human rights legislation and equality legislation into Northern Ireland, and bodies to oversee, protect, and facilitate those processes. And in many respects, the agreement is seen as, in some ways, as the high point, is seen as being the touchstone of the process internationally. But the agreement was only part of what was effectively a much, much wider peace process. So you have the peace agreement, and then which is a very small, it's a very small document, very accessible document, but then it's part of a process that began when very quickly after the ceasefires were declared by the two groups, declared them in almost 30 years ago from today. The second one was in October 1994 by the pro-British groups. That in itself was civil society's groups were not formally involved in the process of declaring ceasefires, but there was lots of secret channels of communication, confidence building statements by governments, back channel negotiations going on, which enabled the ceasefires, the organizations to declare their ceasefires. One of the distinctive features of the Northern Ireland process, I think, is that there were no clear winners and losers. It wasn't the situation with, say, with South Africa, which was happening around the similar time, where the white majority government effectively held up its hands and said, we give up and we'll hand over power to the ANC. It wasn't comparable with the situation, say, in Sri Lanka more recently, where there was a military victory by the state over the Tamil Tigers. It wasn't even similar to the situation in the Basque region of Spain, where ETA effectively surrendered, gave up. Everybody claims to have won in Northern Ireland. Nobody claims to have lost. And the importance of that is it impacts on how the process unfolds. Because everybody's coming in from a degree of strength in some sense. And that the same time as there was this absence of winners and losers, it was counterbalanced by a complete absence of trust. The British state didn't trust the combatants didn't trust the British state, the pro-British groups didn't trust the pro-Irish groups. So there was an absence of trust, and civil society often didn't trust the militarists. So there was an absence of trust in the outset of the process. And a lot of what I will talk about the process itself, was about building trust. And a lot of the work that civil society did going through this was about building trust at different levels, and then effectively civil society do themselves out of a job. You know, peace building work should be transient work. It shouldn't be a career. You live, if you're working in your own society building peace, the ideal is you do yourself out of a job. And effectively, I'm no longer working in that field. I feel I've done that. The peace process itself was multi-layered and inclusive. So there were political developments, there were community developments, there was street level antagonism, street level activity going on, all at the same time. And a lot of the examples I will give were all happening simultaneously. So it's a complex process in which the political dynamics of the establishing the institutions were being impacted by what was happening on the ground, and what was happening on the ground was impacting up and down with the political institutions. So it's a messy process. And it continued. Technically, it's still ongoing. The European Union is still funding peace-building work in Northern Ireland, 25 years after the agreement and 30 years after the programme has started. And that would be another key element, I would say, is that, you know, peace building is not quick, and it's also not cheap if you want to do it successfully. And I think for some of the reasons why Northern Ireland has been relatively successful is because there's been that commitment of support from a wide variety of actors over a sustained period of time. I think if you look more widely at the literature and a lot of the work that's being done around civil society or around peace building, that the potential role of civil society is often overlooked. The focus is very much on state level actors, institutional reforms, high level diplomacy, and so forth. But I think when you look at other conflicts around the world, you'll see that unless you get a sustained buy-in and commitment and support from civil society and from the wider population, you end up with a peace that can be very fragile, can have lots of dissatisfaction, and can be very unstable. And I think you need a strong civil society buy-in to ensure a degree of sustainability over the long durée of conflict transformation. Northern Ireland then was fairly well established with civil society, a strong, diverse civil society, not all involved in politics. You know, this would include the faith-based groups, the churches, it would include some of the sporting networks and so forth that were actively involved in the wider society during the conflict. And although there was a militarized conflict going on for 25, 30 years, normal life continued as possible. It wasn't an all-out war in Northern Ireland. So you had this strange situation with an armed conflict going on, but also with daily life continuing. And you could either seek out the conflict or you could effectively avoid it. So we had a strong civil society here. It did try to impact on the society, on the conflict, and reduce the conflict. A women's-led movement, the Peace People, in the 1970s, they were awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1976 for their attempts to bring peace in Northern Ireland. They had some impact at the time, but not on a sustained basis. So civil society had been doing its work, but it also is important that the work of civil society had to align with the work of the other political actors, with the armed groups, with the governments, and then coming in with it. Civil society wasn't powerful enough to influence and create the dynamics for peace in and of itself. It could influence it when peace was there. The work we did was not heavily theorized. We were very much making things up as we went along. We had ideas. There was civil society-led review called the Opsahl Commission in the early 1990s, which tried to set out the grounds for how peace should be built, what should be involved. But a lot of people were coming at it from a very uninformed stages. We were finding out what we were doing, making it up as we were going along. We drew heavily on other countries. We drew heavily on the South African experience, who were a few years ahead of us, looking at what they'd done, seeing if we could apply the same sort of models, the same sort of approaches as they were doing, seeing what they'd done well, but also looking at what they'd done wrong so that we could avoid things as well. Another thing with it, the work being done here was effectively indigenous. A lot of conflict situations, post-conflict situations, you see international NGOs getting involved and so forth. We didn't have that. We basically, it was all done by local groups skilling themselves up, talking to other people, but it wasn't international NGOs coming in and doing the work for us. It was looking at ideas and developing it as we went along. I've said the difference between, maybe highlighting a little bit of a difference between the political processes and civil society processes. But one example in the negotiation process, the idea was that negotiations would be relatively inclusive and all the political parties were being encouraged to take part in or given the right to take part in it. And a process was set up to ensure that some of the political representatives of the armed groups were also included in the process, even though they didn't have any formally elected representatives. So there was a model set up to try and legitimize the participation of actors who didn't have any involvement. And that gave civil society an opportunity. A group of women set up a political party called the Women's Coalition. It drew from across the political spectrum, left, right, pro-British, pro-Irish. It was basically designed to bring a new voice to the table. They ran as a political party from 1996 to 2006. They were relatively successful. Their main impact was in feeding into the negotiations of the agreement and including other voices away from the polarized pro-British and pro-Irish. And they're widely thought of as highlighting the importance of processes of reconciliation, sharing, integration, and recognition of the importance of women within political processes going forward. So they're seen as being a very vital part of the process and an interjection from civil society, if you like, which wasn't there anywhere near it previously. So that was an important part from a very early stage, that civil society could mobilize an impact on it and take up opportunities where they existed within the process. But from a very early stage, or from the very earliest stages of the post-ceasefire period, the communities, the civil society, residential communities and so forth, got involved in degrees of peace-building activity in terms of building trust between and within communities. One thing I should say is that Northern Ireland has always been a relatively divided society, two quite polarized communities, pro-British and pro-Irish, pretty much equal in numbers. And the conflict also led to a fairly segregated society, so that residential areas are either all pro-British people or either all pro-Irish people. And in particular areas such as Belfast, heavily segregated with walls between the communities, so that they were very visibly divided. So there was a lot of work to do in terms of starting processes of dialogue and discussion within and between communities, starting to build trust, to build an understanding of what the peace process was about. Although the peace agreement itself was put to a referendum and received the majority support, the majority of the people supported the referendum, a lot of people were not happy with it. A lot of people were not happy with the involvement of political representatives of armed groups involved in the discussions. A lot of people were not happy with the idea that people who had been in prison for violent crimes were now considered by some to be legitimate political actors. So there were a lot of tensions running around, and those tensions were both at the high level, political level, and at the grassroots level. As I said earlier on, a lot of mistrust at the early stages, partly built out of a lack of any form of engagement with each other over the previous 20, 25 years. And in partly, this meant that while there was euphoria initially when the ceasefires had been declared, there was also a lot of underlying social tensions running between the communities and between institutions and the grassroots, and the grassroots and institutions. A lot of uncertainty, and almost immediately those tensions erupted into public disorder, street disorder. And part of that was linked to it was largely linked to the distinctive social environment of Northern Ireland, which the pro-British community has a history of organising regular big commemorative parades to mark their British identity and their British history. A lot of those parades would be, or some of them would go close to or even through pro-Irish areas. There'd be often quite hostile atmospheres associated with them. They had continued all the way through the conflict. This wasn't a new thing, but they were more visible, more public, and became much more contentious immediately after the ceasefires. It's almost as if the people's focus had moved away from worrying about bullets and bombs going off, and they started to look at lower levels of tension and sources of conflict. And we almost immediately went into a situation of ending of armed conflict, but beginning of street level conflicts. And there were frequent outbreaks of disorder, of rioting, particularly during the summer season, when the pro-British groups would organise up to 2,000 of these marches across Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland's a small place, you know, it's a population now of under 2 million people. It's only 80 miles by 60 miles in geography. So it's a small place, and we had a lot of these events, and there was a lot of tensions. For example, in 1996, in July 1996, one of the big marches led to a week of rioting, beginning with the pro-British people rioting because the march was stopped, and when the march was decided to go ahead, the pro-Irish people started reacting and protesting about it. So we had a week of intensive rioting. Airports closed, ports closed, traffic closed, everything completely closed down. And part of that was fed by, you know, absence of trust in each other, and absence of trust in the police who are trying to police the situation. And that was one of the earliest areas where it became, the role of civil society became very active in trying to take a role in restraining the disorder, because it was happening it was an annual cycle of these marches. that we knew that from 1996, the same thing would happen in the same period in 1997, the same thing would happen in 1998. And I was working with a community-based organisation at the time in an area of the city where it had been subject to intensive violence and disorder, and who came up, the people I was working with were trying to work out how to reduce the tensions next year. And they came up with the idea of using this new technology of mobile telephones, which at the time, although it's ubiquitous now, in 1997, nobody had, or very few people had a phone. They were still brick-like structures, and nobody had. But the idea was that if people had these telephones, they could communicate with other people working on the ground. They could communicate with people on the other side of the conflict. They could stand on the streets and monitor the tensions and monitor the situations, but also keep in communication with people at the same time. And a network of people was set up. A small number of phones were actually hired for a short period of time at the time. Grants were given to pay for people to do this. And people went out on the streets and they stood at flashpoints where tensions were expected, and they liaised with each other. If a crowd of people were gathering on one side of the street, say the pro-British side, and another crowd on the pro-Irish side, the community leaders would negotiate with each other. They couldn't physically go and talk to each other. That was both dangerous and would undermine their sense of position within their community. So they used the phones to communicate with each other and started to say, look, if you start to move these people away this way, we'll start to do this, and we'll start to try and diffuse the tensions. And it became a very practical way of people building trust in each other. They were prepared to do what they said they were going to do. They were trying to explain the challenges to each other and reduce the tensions. And this also began this time when people started working with the police, because there was very limited trust in the police. The police had been one of the key actors during the conflict, and people on both sides didn't trust the police, and the police didn't trust the people on the ground who had been trying to kill them relatively recently. But again, some of the people got phone contact details from the police, and police gave them their numbers. They were able to stand on street corners and talk to the police. The police may only be 50 meters away across the other side of the street, but they physically couldn't go and talk to each other. That would be political suicide on both sides. The political actors were refusing to engage with the police, but at the same time were talking to the police and helping to convince the police that they should position their officers in different ways, that they should maybe retreat or not intervene at this situation, that the community would come in and do this work and try to calm down the tensions. And this process was slow. It was having some results, and over months and over years, it became a standard process where an expectation of street disorder, of crowd trouble, of tensions around big marches would predominantly be dealt with by either the local community or the local communities working with the police. And it got to the stage where the police were very much relying on civil society actors to take the lead in this situation. I remember some years later talking to somebody on one side, a pro-British guy, complaining that police were relying on him to do their job, and he complained that he'd recently been on holiday and got a phone call while he was in the south of Spain on holiday, asking the police if he could go and help deal with some disorder in his area. But it was an example of the fact that the police increasingly came to rely on people on the ground, on civil society. So there was a networks of people linked through using mobile telephones to connect each other. There were human rights activists out on the ground. There were monitoring the situation, the way the police were policing the parades and so forth. There were civil society actors who were working as mediators to come into intervene in tensions as they developed. So there was a diversity of people on the streets, working with each other, working across the divide, and helping to reduce the tensions. It wasn't a quick process. It was something that kept going over a period of years, and tensions were gradually reduced over a period of years as the peace process went on. But it was also part of a wider process in which people started to build trust with each other, but also started to build trust with the police, and the police started to trust the communities on the ground. People started to see what each other were capable of doing and willing to do. An extension of that a few years later was, as it was not linked to the parades and the marches, but more just to ongoing tensions between the communities, was to develop a network, or to expand some of the networks as tension monitors. This was a model that we identified in South Africa, where people from diverse groups, there was community activists, there was mediators, there was church people, there were students, and that they came together and physically placed themselves in areas of tension. So it could, the first one was a situation where there'd been tension between two neighbouring residential areas, which had been going on for months, which had been stones, rocks, Molotov cocktails, and shots being fired between these two communities. And the political leadership had been able to stop the tensions, but someone who I was working with, a mediator who I was working with, proposed that civil society actors would come in and physically walk around the area as a deterrent. And we dressed in high-vis jackets with high-vis, with hard hats and so forth. And the tensions were all occurring late at night. So we would go out into the streets at 10 o'clock at night, and we would stay there till about 2 o'clock in the morning, just to act as a deterrent. We got the agreement from both sides of the community. We went in there, and it was very effective. Almost immediately, things started to calm down. So that it was incredibly dull work, because it was dark, it was cold when we started doing it. It was November, it was wet often, and there was absolutely nobody around. But that intervention by civil society gave a breathing space for the communities to step back, and gave it time for it to calm down, and for dialogue between the political leaders locally to stop the violence. And that model was another one that replicated around in different towns and villages. We went in, and local tensions, we just basically went and told people, knew that we were coming in, and we stood and put ourselves between the different sides, and they decided not to attack us, literally. and it just provided a buffer between the various communities where we were working on. So that was another model that grew out of the civic activism. A third approach was the development of models of what you might have heard of restorative justice. It's come out of very much of indigenous communities in New Zealand, North America, of rather than looking for punishment between perpetrators and victims, it seeks to form some form of reconciliation, some apologies, and attempts to reincorporate the offenders into the community rather than to punish them. And one of the other issues that was around throughout the conflict in Northern Ireland and in those early days is where there was an absence of the police as being recognised as an effective and fair justice provider, law provider. The armed groups took the role of punishing people. So there was a very heavy attempt, or very persistent examples where local people who complained about crimes, of people burgling their houses, of selling drugs and so forth, rather than reporting them to the police, would report them to the paramilitary organizations, the armed groups, and the armed groups would intervene. They didn't kill people, but they shot them through. They did what's called kneecapping, which was shooting them in the legs or shooting them in the elbows as a punishment for doing it, as a deterrent. So this process carried on after the ceasefires. After the ceasefires, because the ceasefires were not about using guns and bullets, people switched to beating people, and they used baseball bats, which were much more violent and vicious at times, but they were seen as being a very rapid form of justice, but they were also very brutal, caused severe injuries, and were seen as not sort of something of the way forward. So discussions in the late 1990s, in the early years of the peace process, community groups who are linked to the armed groups who've moved away from conflict and moved more towards pro-peace modes, proposed setting up restorative justice networks within their communities, so that instead of reporting them to the armed groups, they would report problems to the restorative justice. The restorative justice people would engage with the perpetrators and attempt to get them to change their ways and not be a nuisance within the communities, not be the problem. They were dealing with relatively low levels of antisocial behaviour, low-level crime, and so forth. But these groups were set up in the late 1990s. They're still going now. They become quite established organisations, working as part of the justice system, working with the police, often getting referrals from the police to deal with problems that the police are considered not appropriate to deal with, or they're not effective to deal with. So they would go in and work with perpetrators, often young males, often unemployed young men, often involved in drugs and relatively low levels of activity. And this would be a way in which the communities take a more a role in dealing with crime, dealing with social disorder, and has continued and is seen as a very effective mechanism. And only last year, I worked with the Ministry of Justice here, developing a new protocol for this type of work as community-based work, as something they want to see and develop and expand moving forward. So that's another example in which community-based activities have supported work within the communities and as part of this process. I'm running out of time here. I just want to skip on to. I mentioned the fact that the police were not seen as seen as part of the problem, and the peace agreement included for a process of reform of the police, and that the process of how the reforming was being done. There was a big review body constructed, bringing in a variety of policing experts and academics from the British government side, from the Irish government side, from the US and from South Africa, but also an extensive process of consultation and communication with people on the ground about what they wanted and what they expected from a new police organisation, what they saw as the problems and how they wanted it. So it was a 2-year process of consultation to set up a completely new police organisation, which was going to be very heavily human rights compliant, human rights being written through the whole of the policing structures, with extensive levels of oversight and accountability bodies, including community-based accountability bodies at various levels of heavy process of accountability of the police to make sure that they comply with human rights processes. And again, that has been seen as being a very effective process. The police, reformed police, were established in 2001. From the situation in 1994, when the ceasefires were there, when the police were seen as a purely militarized force, the police are now seen as very much a non-politicized organization. They are treated much more like a police would in other parts of the UK, which means that some people don't like them anyway because they're the police, but don't like them because they are pro one community or the other. And when it comes to the policing of public order events and parades and such like, they have been seen to effectively shown themselves as being very high standards of human rights compliance. I've worked with them extensively over many years, the police there, and their human rights understandings is probably much higher than that most police organizations. And again, it's been developed over time, and particularly in working with local community groups on the ground, local civil society, to establish police practice and good standards. So just summarizing some points there, I say that peace building work in Northern Ireland's been relatively successful. There are problems with it. It's not perfect. Society is still very segregated. The political institutions are not. That was just my reminder to shut up. Political institutions are not very effective, and the armed groups are still there, but they've effectively morphed into criminal gangs doing drugs and money lending and things like that. So if you think about it in terms of theories around peace building, we've got a negative peace rather than a positive peace. We've got an absence of violence, but we've still got a lot of suspicion and mistrust in the society. But I'd say that we are well on the way to a sustainable peace. There are some issues that are still unresolved. We've got issues to do with the legacy of, particularly with people killed during the conflict. There's never been any sense of a truth and reconciliation process, which has often been talked about and is often seen as being important in other conflict situations. But I think going back to what I said earlier on about the fact that there's no clear winners and losers here has impeded that sense of doing a truth and reconciliation process. And none of the key actors, the British government and the IRA, in my view, were ever going to be willing to give the truth up about what they had hoped for. So there's still an issue about dealing with unsolved killings and a lot of people feeling about a lack of justice. But Northern Ireland is a peaceful society. It's a low crime society. It's still got lots of legacy issues from the conflict, but I think it has been relatively successful. And some of the reasons for that is that I think it's been the degree of inclusivity in the process from international governments like the US government, the British government, the Irish government, local political actors, but also the role that it can play for civil society in particular has been vital. Bringing armed groups in, members of armed groups into the process has been fundamental. Part of the success has been that it's been funded, and it's important if you wanted to be able to do a lot of the peace building work that's been done through civil society. People need to be able to work on that activity fairly full time. Huge amounts of money it's cost. Policing reform's not cheap. Institutional reform is not cheap. Northern Ireland's been funded through the European Union for a special program on peace funding. It's also got a lot of money from the USA, also from the British government and the Irish government. You can't do peace building without funding. It also takes time. I remember when I first started working, and it was an area that I was particularly any real experience, academic or otherwise, at, but I was also always surprised, disappointedly surprised, how long everything took. It takes time. It's slow. You take 2 steps forward, 1 step sideways, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward. It's a constant dance, but you do get there. But you need to have that sustained commitment. And you also have to look at the context of the society you're working in. And Northern Ireland, I think, was fortunate. It was in a number of sweet spots. It's a small-scale society. It was part of the European Union before the European Union expanded. It was one of the few conflicts in Europe from the 1970s and 1980s. So it was a trouble spot that needed to be addressed. So we were fortunate in that sense in being willing to attract the money. And you have to think about the different contexts of different societies, of what works and what doesn't work. And small scale in Northern Ireland was something. It would be very different sort of connections that you can make in a larger scale society, whether it's just larger populations or geographic distance and so forth. But you have to make the most of what your opportunities are as well. So I think that's been something we've been relatively successful for. And to my mind now, we're in a process of sustainable peace. We're not where I would like us to be, but I don't think we're going to get where I'd like us to be, because I don't think there is the political will to do it anymore. And I think you do need political will. You do need to go with the waves. And that if the moves are going towards peace, then civil society can do an awful lot to make it more sustainable. So I'm going to shut up there and hand back to you, Dimitri, or Glenn.
Okay, thanks a lot, Neil, especially for the summary at the end. I think that draws some very important thoughts. And now we have an opportunity to ask you some questions. And there have been a number in the chat. Maybe we take 10 minutes for this. Maybe not all of them we can answer in this round, but maybe we'll have some time at the end as well to address them. Should I read them out to you? Neil?
Yeah, why don't you do that rather than me try to?
Okay. So there's one question, the one that was the first one, about the peace agreement, in which you said about the peace agreement.
Yeah.
You said there were no losers and no winners. Each side feels that they are no clear-cut winners. Each side feels that they won. Was this effect specifically planned and managed, or did it happen spontaneously?
I think it got to the stage in the early 1990s that there was a realization that the armed conflict could continue, but wouldn't resolve everything. I think the British government knew they couldn't defeat the IRA. The IRA knew they couldn't defeat the British government. There were back-channel discussions, and I think there were key political statements made to make people realize that there was an opportunity to move towards dialogue and discussion around resolving the issues and moving away from a military solution. So there was a space created, and it was important to recognize that that often people say we'll never speak to somebody, even when they are speaking to people. And I think unless you're going to achieve a complete military solution to a conflict, you're going to do it through discussion. So you may as well get those channels of discussion open quickly and keep them open.
Okay.
Even if you have to deny it, but keep them open.
Right. And along those lines, I guess the question that many people want to hear an answer to is about negotiation tactics that can be used, especially with the people who, for example, lost their relatives in a conflict, or who feel a hatred so strong that they are not willing to have anything to do with another side. What specifically helped you in mediating such conflicts on the streets? Or maybe you have some specific techniques, or maybe some illustrative cases. I think that question right.
I wasn't living here through the majority of the conflicts, and I'm not from here, and I didn't have relatives injured or killed, or friends injured or killed to the same extent that other people did. It is a problem for a lot of people. Some people are able to forgive and move on, and some people are not. And I think I don't think there's an easy solution to there. I think the Truth and Reconciliation process tries to do that, but I'm not sure even in South Africa, say, for example, where it was widely lauded, I don't think it was effective on a long term. It was a good PR in the early stages of it, but I think a lot of people committed to something which I then think they felt dissatisfied with. I think as you come out of conflict, it does take time on a lot of different levels, not only to resolve the issues, but also bluntly that people will die, and they will die, not knowing what happened to their husband, their wives, their lovers, their friends, and so forth. It will take time for people to move on, and society to move on, and some people will never move on. And I've worked with people who will never move on, and they never will move on. They're just bitter, and with good reason at times. But society has to find a way to move on, even if not everybody can move on with it.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for answering that. I think one of the important lessons in your speech to me was about the difference between peace and justice, because I also have a lot of my friends in the human rights community that tend to prioritize justice.
Yes.
I have also those who tend to prioritize peace. And sometimes it's difficult to find a balance, but I don't think despite the popular sayings, they don't equal each other in a complex situations like Northern Ireland.
There was, I think, not fully resolved discussion between the approaches taken, say, if you like, by the peace building conflict transformation community and the human rights community, one of which prioritizes justice and the other prioritizes peace. And that issue that you raised there is exactly there. It's been debated, discussed, but not fully resolved.
Right. Okay. So maybe we can also move to another question, which is about the police as a part of the state and the role that it has played. How is it possible that society decided to take some of the functions of the police and the state, in fact, allowed it to happen? How can you explain that?
The police are, it's never a monolithic organization. There's always different voices, different attitudes within an organization. The police, very early on, we identified police officers who were pro-change, saw that things had to change, had to become different. fairly senior, but not too senior, still young, still ambitious, recognizing that things need to change, and that some of the things that the police have been doing wrong or police have been doing were wrong. All the way through the conflict, the police had limited capacity to deal with what you might think of as ordinary policing activities. So some of that work had been done by communities on the ground. And when the big review of policing was done, I think one of the key statements they included in the report was that policing, they separated out the role of the police from policing as an activity. And they said that policing is too important to leave to the police alone. So they recognized very early on that communities do a lot of policing themselves. Parents police their kids, tell them what's right and what's wrong. Communities set their standards and expectations. And I think some of the work in the early stages of the peace process just took that further, so that it recognized that if you want a peaceful society, particularly where there are tensions, then people have to go out and do more rather than just delegate it to specific people in uniforms. A lot of the activity that was done in the early days of the peace process isn't done nowadays. Nowadays we've moved much more to a situation where the police get on and do everything, but civil society keeps an eye on it. It sits on bodies that the police report to on a regular basis so that there is still expected to have police accountable to people. And at times of extreme tension, people will still go out on the streets and try to keep the situation calm. It's always assumed now that if there is tensions in Belfast, if there are riots happening, and they still happen occasionally, that it won't only be the police that are expected to calm the situation down. Sometimes the police in every country, sometimes the police are a problem. People don't always like the police or the way the police do it. The police are not always very good at what they do, or not all police are very good at what they do.
Yeah, but I think the idea of community-based models of policing, and also the increase of the role of community in actually ensuring policing functions, is key in this. But anyhow, I want to maybe move on, and I see that maybe we have room for just one or two more questions, and I will probably group them. So I think one question is asking about this complex process of peace building. And the question is, what provides actually the greater impetus in initially moving in a direction of peace? What would you say? Is it top down, the leaders basically leading the society towards peace? Or is it bottom up, driven by the population? So that's first question. And the second is trying to insist on kind of more examples about the concrete tactics of actually what has worked, specific cases of effective communication between different sides. I guess people still want to know, how do you engage someone, for example, whose relative died in a terrorist act? What exactly could be said to them to explain why not all the terrorists should be in jail? Why are they sitting at negotiation tables? And so on. So I guess those two questions kind of underline both some of the complexities in the conflict in Northern Ireland.
Which comes first? I think they're mutually reinforcing. At times, the political process was the dominant process in Northern Ireland, and at times it wasn't. In a period shortly after the agreement, the political institutions collapsed, and they collapsed for 5 years. And they were, the government, local government, devolved government wasn't working. But the work was carried on the ground. A lot of the key work in terms of building relationships with the police at a time when the police had recently been reformed was going on in that process. And although people had seen that the police had technically been reformed, they wanted to actually make sure it was working through practical engagement. And that work was done, and because that work was done on the ground, some of the political parties then agreed that policing was effectively done and moved back into political negotiations again. So the work was being done on the ground to prepare the ground for the political dialogue to go. I think it's more difficult at times. I think you need political will, goodwill, and we haven't had that so much in recent years in Northern Ireland, but we've got to a stage where things are not particularly problematic. So we've got a safe distance from the conflict that we haven't got the levels of tensions that we once had. In terms of how do people build relationships? How do they slowly and persistently, dialogue, discussions, endless meetings, endless conversations, dull, tedious conversations at times. We had meetings when we were doing the networks where we had people in the groups who were members of different armed groups, who were still active members of different armed groups. And you would see it over 1 year, you'd have some problems occur and people broke off all communications. They wouldn't speak to each other. They wouldn't engage with each other. Eventually, you managed to persuade them to come back in the room together. And after a while, a similar sort of process, similar sort of tensions and problems doesn't close down the relationship completely. So they gradually, slowly build trust with each other by working with each other, by understanding each other's difficulties, so that you can accept at times that people can't always do what they say they want to do. And that's not an act of mistrust or bad faith. It's just that things have to go slowly, and not all areas do they move as quickly as you might like. So you keep the dialogue open. You have some very uncomfortable dialogues. And sometimes that process of dialogue is necessary to move on to the next step. I was at one public meeting where about a contested march, and the body who'd been set up to deal with the issues was there, and then the local community who were supporting the people whose march had been stopped was in the audience. And it was I've been in a lot of riots and a lot of areas of public disorder and violence on the streets, but this was the scariest meeting I'd been in. There was a real atmosphere in this meeting by the people who were from the government-led body, who were being attacked by people in the audience. Absolutely verbally as violent and as vicious and nasty as you. And I found out afterwards that they had their security guards with the cars running outside the door, expecting to have to leave at very short notice. This meeting went on for 45 minutes, extremely vicious. And the chair of the meeting then said, okay, we've heard what you said. Maybe we just take 5 minutes and have a cup of tea. And they literally went out and had a cup of tea. People made the tea. The people stood around talking. They carried on being abusive and so forth, but it broke the ice. The people had had the chance to say what they wanted to say. And the second half of the meeting was much more civilized, and it moved on to a different stage. And I've been in lots of other meetings like this where the meeting starts out with people shouting at each other, swearing at each other, in tears, fighting almost. And then having got to that stage, you can then move on to the next stage, which is, you've heard me, I've had what I've said to say, I've done what I've said what I wanted to say, and now we can move on. So you can end up in some very difficult situations, and developing that skill in facilitating dialogue and managing the tensions processes is, another area of skill which civil society developed. It's sort of coming out of mediation, facilitation type activities, but very important as part of an ongoing process of bringing people together, getting them a chance to speak to each other, hear each other, and come out of the other side, willing to meet again as well.
Okay.
Which is part of why the whole thing takes so flipping long.
Yeah.
And it does take long.
Yeah. So on one hand, it's dull, tedious, and very long work. On the other hand, you have to be ready to hear some abuse and be in some very violent hotspots at the same
Yes.
time. So.
And you also have to recognize that people will change. And people who'd been in prison often found the prison process transformative. They went into prison as street fighting young men and used the prison experience to read, to engage in political dialogue, to educate themselves, and they came out transformed. And you have to recognize that process, that some of the people that get involved in violent activity do so as a reaction when they're to the experience they've had when they're 18, 19, 20. And by the time they're 40, they're very different people. And you have to recognize that people can and will change. And I've had numerous conversations with people, and so they would say about talking about someone and said, you know what he did, and you know what he was in for. I never asked what people were in for. It didn't matter to me. I was speaking to the person I was speaking to now, not the person who had killed how many people 20 years ago, or who'd set up a bomb and killed people 10 years ago. I always tried to work with the people that was in my working with me, and I have to try and trust what they're doing and trust what they're saying. And it didn't always work. You knew at times that some people were, we called it wearing multiple hats. That sometimes they put on a hat and they were a community worker, and sometimes they take that hat off and put on another one, and they were a politician, or they were a member of an armed group. And they could be all those different roles depending on what they were doing. And it was, people play multiple roles, and you have to learn the process. It's not something you've got to be flexible in as engaged in this process, and you've got to recognize. I think you've got to work with people as they are and what they say.
Well, yeah, I think we have to put this extremely inspiring and interesting conversation on pause for a moment. But thanks for reminding about the compassion and the heart that goes into this type of work. And so I think this is,
and the courage it takes.
Yeah. Okay. So, and we'll have Neil with us for some time more, and we can also talk at the end, hopefully, if we have the time, of what to do next. But now we want to split into groups and have maybe conversations on some of those topics in the smaller circles. So, Vlad, would you like to lead us into the working groups?
Yeah, very briefly. Nothing super special this time. We're gonna have 3 groups. So I have no idea how many of us will decide to join the group. So obviously that's a voluntary thing. You don't have to. You can stay here if you wish. And you can choose whichever group you want to join. Once I open them, they are named. There is one English group and two Russian-speaking groups. So you can just decide which language you prefer to speak in the group or which language you can speak. And then you can either join one of the Russian-speaking groups or the only English-speaking one. And me, Dmitry, and Yelena will go to these three groups as facilitators. And there is like, we don't send you there with a clear-cut question to answer or to collect like 10 points on this particular issue or something. We want it to be more or less open discussion for 20 minutes. And the facilitators are going to be there for the sake of trying to deepen that conversation, whichever way it goes. So there is no, the question for the group's discussion, but let us take this conversation in the spirit of what do we make out of this? So to also try to take these learnings from something which has happened in the past out there to something we can try to learn from and apply down here, whichever here is for you. Yeah, so that's the overall spirit of what we invite you to discuss in the groups. And then the facilitators are going to be there for you, and let's see how it goes. I bet most of you feel you didn't have enough time. It's not even like chances are, I'm just more than sure that's the case. And that's, I don't know, inevitable, pre-planned, intentional. So that's all right. I don't know. I feel we had a very interesting conversation unfolding from the dialogue we had here in the group. And we have 5 more minutes. Like, I don't know, I'm improvising, like Dima, Lena, and the rest of the team and the rest of all of you. Actually, let me know if that's okay. What would you say if we just give time for 3 more questions to Neil? And they might be like, one question from each group, but not necessarily. It's not like, okay, now group number 1 choose the question, group number 2 choose the question. So it's more like, feel each other and see what's most significant at the moment. And then in like even in 4 minutes, maybe we even just ask all 3 questions in a row, and that will actually take all the time we have. And Neil, you then like see, maybe you give us a short, general answer to all of them, maybe something else. And also our translator will need to leave in 4 minutes. So maybe I will also help translating after that, or we'll figure it out. So what do you think if we just take 3 questions, not answering them right away, but just take all of them? Then we formally close for those who need to go. And then maybe take another like 10 informal minutes for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of
Sounds good.
just a small reply. I mean, I'm fine with it. I just want to also to see this as a reflection of the general process. Yeah, we learn something from we want to learn more, but we also want to apply it to our context. So let's kind of keep it in the spirit and remember that we are not only tied in this Zoom session or in this time frame, but we can also connect. And kind of that's what we also want to do with PeaceLab, not only learn from experts, from practitioners, from different contexts, but also build those connections that allow us to come together as a community and to actually do something. But I'm not going to take more time with that. So let's jump into questions.
True. Okay, so let it be by voice. Just raise your hand and whatever felt most significant from the initial dialogue or the conversations in the group, the questions which are, ringing in the air.
everyone is say different.
So I'm just, we actually had an opportunity to ask Neil a question, and maybe he could share the answer, or, you know, within the other two questions, but he spoke to about kind of part of the challenges is when people who have either been victims or been traumatized, that they're fighters, and their identity is wrapped up with being fighters and things like that. So he spoke a lot to sort of identity sometimes being a challenge.
Okay, so let's take it as a number one.
And I'd raise another issue that was somewhat discussed in our group, and I think it relates to a model of community-based peace building, which relies that so much on civil society. And I guess the question on many people's minds is, how do you build peace in places where civil society is under extreme pressure or has been attacked and destroyed and is kind of feeling apathetic and so on. So I guess that's something that came up.
Right. And then following the tendency, I can also voice a question from the group, which is not by my authorship, but that was discussed. And I assume it might be in the air for many of us here. So, here is this context of the Northern Ireland, which is like, within the country conflict of a particular scale. And now in the modern days, we have this PeaceLab as a response to the modern conflicts which are happening, like, the actual interstate military wars, like the Russian-Ukrainian war, the new cycle of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like all the things which are happening here. So the obvious question is, which takeaways from this experience do you think are applicable to the modern wars and the modern conflicts? And also, do you see actual like actors who can be, called the peace actors in the modern times, not like politicians calling for truth or like, ceasefire, or like obviously winning one side, pro one side or pro another side, but do you see any peace actors in the modern field?
Yeah, Neil, so feel free to answer those in any manner that you feel fit, but just a technical issue first. I mean, to allow Roma to.
Yeah, he said he has another 10 minutes, but not more. So
Okay,
we are still in his favor for 10 minutes.
We have the best interpreters that are sticking with us despite our bad timing. So Neil, floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. I think any society coming out of a conflict will throw up people who will start to speak, will start to find their voice, and maybe who will show leadership. The challenge sometimes is just to reach the middle ground, that you're not coming from one side of a very polarized conflict. In some cases, it's I think of people like Desmond Tutu, who come from a faith background, but who can also take a radical position and transcend a sense of particular community. Not necessarily people you would expect, but I think they will appear. I suspect that there are challenges when civil society is repressed, but if you move to a situation of coming out of a conflict, it does suggest there's going to be some degree of change going on and some degree of space opening up. It's a question of how you do it, and it always has to be done within local context. And I suspect, to touch on what Vlad was saying about the relevance of somewhere like Northern Ireland is that I would say that even if you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict war, there will be tensions in Ukraine about positions people took, as well as between Russia and Ukraine, or the different parts of Ukraine. So there will be issues within communities of a nominally singular identity, as well as between communities. So there will still be lessons to be learned. There will still be issues around dialogue. I did some work earlier this summer with some people from Georgia and Abkhazia. You know, it's about finding scope for dialogue, and I think a lot of that work needs to be done low level, slow, patient work. To touch on the point that Alan raised in terms of what I was saying in the breakout room, was that some people become very invested in their identity linked to a conflict. And I suspect that will occur. You know, people who invested time as fighting in the conflict as opposed to prioritizing their family, or prioritizing their country as opposed to their family, or staying and fighting, or moving into prioritizing their economic interests, for example. There will be lots of different senses around what people do and what sense of their identity they want, or they prioritize. And there's also that tension between coming out of a conflict and those people who see that as an opportunity for doing something new, radical, better. And those people who see, well, we now have to recreate what we had before the conflict started. Those people who see, who are perhaps in favor of the aspects of the conflict, they wanted change, expect the change to come, and others, people who are fighting against the change, maybe just want things to go back to the way they were. And they can never go back. It's always a question of moving on and redefining, because you've always moved on to another position, another time. You've always dealing with the deaths, the injuries, the brutalities, the betrayals. And so you've always got to move on. So there are tensions about a society coming out of conflict is going to have to redefine itself because of being through that conflict. You know, Northern Ireland, the situation in Northern Ireland is different from the situation a few miles away across the border where the conflict didn't exist. It's different again in Scotland or in England or Wales, because it's been in that conflict and because of that history. And that particular history will always have to be worked through, and will take time to work through. And I think that's one of the big things with civil society, is that you can take time to work it through, to have those conversations. Because if you suppress it, if you bottle it up, or if you ignore it, it will come back. You have to deal with the injustices that maybe started the conflict in the beginning, and you have to deal with the injustices that arose through the conflict. But you have to find ways of working that through. And it can't all be done at a political level. It can't all be done at a high level. Otherwise, it will leave lots of people on the ground feeling unhappy and dissatisfied and resentful.
Okay, I think that's a good point to end maybe here. Thanks a lot, Neil, once more. And yeah, I can say that I'm personally really grateful, and I think many people are as well.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And just one last thing that I wanted to say, and maybe others can also say a few parting words and we say goodbye. So PeaceLab format is very simple. Every month we try to organize a speaker about a certain conflict, and we talk. What happens on the margins, what happens beyond that is up to us all. So we'll continue to organize those workshops. We'll continue to create those spaces, but I would also encourage us all to engage deeper and wider than that. And feel free to join PeaceLab Circle, which is a community around those workshops and beyond those workshops as well. And let's see what ideas come out of it.
And I've just posted the link to that. So PeaceLab Circle exists for now as a online group chat in Telegram, but also I guess beginning to exist as an entity or as a proto community. And yeah, so as the whole thing is in the spirit of not just someone coming from outside and telling us what to do, but rather all of us in all of this together being allies. So Neil, also, after the workshop, you're free if you wish to take off the hat of the expert and to join the circle if you wish to.
We all have multiple hats to
yeah
juggle with, right? Yeah. So an identities that we don't always want or sometimes are stuck with, but would like to change. So yeah.
Yeah, the recording is going to be available in some time. So since all of us are doing it for free, we don't promise to, recording on the next day and all the services. But it's going to be available soon. And also, if you want to support the project by donating, you can do it via the links, which I have just once again posted in the chat.
All right. So I mean,
just and basically there are two key ways to stay connected and to learn about the upcoming workshops. Well, three ways. One is if you have registered to this workshop, that you're gonna get emails from us about the next events. Obviously, you can unsubscribe, but also you can do the opposite thing, which is to add our address to the contact list so that the email doesn't end up in spam folder. Or you could also follow our Telegram channel. I will just put the link here as well. Just a second. Or join the circle, which is a closer community. And obviously there we also share about everything.
All right.
So this way.
Okay. All right. So feel free to leave the state and to join us in other spaces.
Yeah, words of gratitude. Thank you, Neil, for coming. I mean, all of this is happening around the vibe which is created by the guest, by the speaker. Thanks for coming. And thank you, the team. Thank you, Roma, for interpreting. We wanted to be a bilingual space in a sense to bring it to Russian-speaking community, but also to keep it global. So that's possible due to translation. And thank all of you for coming, because that's not just us chatting about some things, but, all of us in all of this.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the questions, and I hope you all found it useful.
Great. It's always great to have you, Neil.